meeting. That's very googly and Facebook of you. Second, I want to point out that this event has sold out cyberspace. We had some people who couldn't get on the call, and they contacted me, and we filled up cyberspace. The Zoom meeting reached its capacity. So this, Bill, is either credit to you and your prestige, or the fact that everyone is so bored that absolutely anything would attract their attention.
I'm betting the latter.
Okay. So I wanted to start by just having you tell us a little bit about what you did at Facebook and Google, and what in that work led you to where you are today, in the sense that you saw things that were missing and that needed to happen. Presumably you couldn't get done there. Tell us a little bit about your path to where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and Auden, thanks for joining me on this, and everybody, thanks for joining in this these perilous and surreal times. Yeah, I mean, I think, Auden, you've been in sustainability at Aspen for a long time, and working for a company where you see every day, I think, the impacts of climate and weather and climate change and so on. I joined Google in early '06 because I had been in computer science, wanted to work on, switched to working on climate, and was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. And the founders and others at Google really wanted to do something on climate. I would say over the 15 years since then, I've learned a lot about the space and a lot about what's needed and what companies can do. What I saw at both Google and Facebook was a real interest in each company doing its part, if you will, cleaning up its own operations, beginning to push on its supply chain, speaking out some in public, certainly about what we were doing and what companies could do, but not often speaking out on public policy. And over the last few years, I think I've come to really appreciate much, much more how important a role public policy has in getting us where we need to go on climate. My experience at Google and Facebook and working with people at many other companies was that companies are very willing to decarbonize their own operations. They are willing to engage in activities with their suppliers, to think about creative products they can develop that might help the world decarbonize. But they see a lot of risk in engaging in public policy. And they do, I mean, as I'm sure most of you know, companies speak up on public policy all the time if it matters to their core business. But what we see when it's controversial but not core to their business, they tend to stay quiet. And I think the reason for that is they see risk. They see no risk if they stay silent. So the rational thing to do is to stay quiet. That's what most companies do. So I think when I decided a couple of years ago to leave Facebook, it was because I wanted to look for something that would allow me to really push much harder on climate than I was able to do from inside companies, at least inside companies out here in the Bay Area. And the big gap I saw was public policy. We need companies to take voluntary action. We need behavior change. We need innovation. We need investment. And we really need public policy to set the rules of the market so that the entire economy moves in the direction we need it to go, rather than just some companies that choose to step up and take action themselves. And I know, Auden, I mean, you've been to some extent singing that song for quite a while, I think, in terms of wanting companies to speak up more. And so that's part of why I left Facebook, and part of why we started Climate Voice was to give companies the encouragement and the motivation from their employees and their future employees, students, to really start to speak up and to, as we're putting it, go all in on climate.
And I'm curious, Did you try to do this at Facebook or at Google, and what was the response, or was your sense that the will was not there to do this sort of advocacy? And for the group, I'm going to hammer on this a little, Bill, because this is so close to my heart. What we're talking about when we say advocacy, or at least what I am, and correct me, Bill, if it's not the same thing, is that instead of corporations saying, we're going to cut our carbon footprint 50% by 2030, we want the CEO to write an op-ed in the New York Times saying climate action is critical. We want them to use their lobbying arms, and all of these companies have massively powerful lobbying arms, to publicly lobby for policy on climate, to say this is a primary issue, to use social media outlets, to use catalogs, to use websites, to really hang it out there. So my question, Bill, is did you make a run at this, and what happened, and or was it just not even within the realm of possibility?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, I made a run at it, and I would say the positive view is that I mean, there are companies, and I think maybe Aspen is one, where the CEO and the board feel like this is a critical issue and they are going to speak out, and the company is going to use its influence in all the ways you described: campaign contributions, PACs, trade association memberships, op-eds, sending their lobbyists, etc. There are a few companies that where the direction has come from the top. We're going to do this because it's vital to the future of our society. It's not just about us reducing our carbon footprint. Most companies have been going through a sort of growth in terms of their engagement on climate over the last 15 or 20 years, where they start with a focus on their own internal operations, and then they look at their supply chain and so on. And eventually, I think if you look at other social issues, LGBTQ rights, for example, where companies started with putting their own internal policies in place and eventually got to engaging in public policy. Eventually they get there. And I think we're at a point now where many companies are ready to start engaging on public policy. They need a little bit of a push or some carrots and maybe some sticks. At both Facebook and Google, both companies and many others that I worked with have engaged on some policy issues. They have chosen to stay silent on most. So most companies, many companies at this point, for example, publicly support the Paris Agreement, the Paris Climate Accord, and the goals it has laid out. And in 2017, when President Trump announced that he was going to remove the US from Paris, hundreds of companies, now I think we've got over 3,000 companies joined We Are Still In, basically saying we as an organization are going to do our part. That I think is really important, but it's voluntary action. It is not then supporting the actual binding policies in cities and counties and states and nationally that would get, would help every city, every state, this country and others actually meet the goals of Paris. And so, yes, I mean, at some level, I took a run at it. I made progress, as have many of my peers at many companies, but most companies are still just dipping their toe in the water on advocacy for policy.
Right. And Bill, I'm gonna get to having you describe what you're doing now and how you're doing it, but I want us to rant a little more on this topic to start it off. Let me just give you a few, data. My feeling is that the media, the NGO environmental community, and government, basically everybody gives a pass to corporations who either do a token step or do nothing at all. And the only person calling this out has been US Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and he's been amazing. He sent us, even Aspen Skiing Company, we're pretty active, scathing letters. You're not showing up in Washington. And he says, where are you guys? And yet The NGO community doesn't criticize them. If Microsoft announces that they're going to cut carbon 100% and go carbon negative, they get praised, and no one says, well, why isn't your CEO speaking out? I had someone from Microsoft at a dinner party, a senior environmental person, say to me, I can't talk to you about why we can't talk about climate policy. And the corruption is very deep. Many of you know the organization, the Coalition for Environmentally Responsible Economies in Boston. Well, one of their members, so one of the members of this environmental group is GM. GM is now supporting Trump's rollbacks of auto emission standards. And this is a third of US greenhouse gas emissions. It's the primary US greenhouse gas emission. So it's this crazy land where not only can corporations lobby counter to the mission of an NGO, but they get the imprimatur of that NGO and nobody criticizes them. So Bill, my question for you is, how come? And then second, let's roll into specifically what you're doing, what your strategy is, and how you're going about it. Because I think the path you're taking is interesting and unique, and frankly, it's not necessarily the path that I would take. But let's talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two sides to that. One is, why do companies not speak up? And I think it's interesting that the person you were talking to from Microsoft said, I can't even tell you why we don't speak. I rarely let my employer muzzle me quite that much, but now I don't have an employer, so that's not an issue. I think companies are honestly afraid, right? So whether it's in Washington or in the state capitol, companies that are at that are dependent on the government for regulatory issues, where they're worried about risk from regulation, or they want tax breaks or anything else, where if decisions don't go or policies don't go their way, it hurts them, then they're afraid of pissing off somebody who could then retaliate. And I think certainly when Trump entered the White House 3+ years ago, a lot of people were very worried that he would, they did something that made him upset, he'd tweet and he'd do something that hurt them. I think that fear has abated a bit, but generally, there are a lot of ways in which some companies are at risk from what can happen in Washington or in state capitals. And so they advocate for their self-interest, and then they stay on the sidelines for other things. And the result is that you've got all of the fossil fuel companies who have a deep interest in preserving the status quo, which is taking us off the climate cliff. All of them are very active lobbying for their self-interest. And they do it in cities, they do it in states, they do it in countries, and internationally for that matter. And they are the dominant business voice in most climate-related policy discussions, because it directly affects their core business. Most other companies doesn't affect their core business so much, and so their decision is, it's risky if we speak up, they stay on the sidelines. And that's a problem. To your point about NGOs, you're right. Generally, there are NGOs that call companies out. Greenpeace is certainly very vocal, as are a number of others like them, who call companies out who are misbehaving in various ways. They tend to really focus on the ones they think are the really bad actors, so the fossil fuel companies or the banks that are funding massive amounts of new fossil fuel projects. They don't tend to call out the ones that are decent actors. So Greenpeace, for example, one of the reasons I ended up with the job at Facebook in 2012 was starting, I think it was 2010, they ran a campaign against Facebook called Unfriend Coal, calling out Facebook for siting a data center in East Central Oregon, where the utility was at that point, I think, 85% coal powered. And Greenpeace seized upon that as a way to shine a big spotlight on the fact that tech companies are using a lot of energy, and in some cases choosing to use dirty electricity. And so Greenpeace beats up companies that way, and then in fact turns around and thanks them when they step up. So when Facebook committed to 100% clean energy and then started making progress, Greenpeace thanked them and held them up as an example for other companies. On the policy front, I don't know of any NGOs that are calling out companies for being on the sidelines. They are thanking the companies when they do speak up, but not calling them, holding them accountable when they stay on the sidelines. And that's something that we want to change. We want to actually give them a lot more praise when they do speak up, but we absolutely want to hold them accountable when they stay on the sidelines.
So let's hear about that. I have one, question that we'll get to later is whether corporations now face more risk from not having a public climate position than from taking one. I think we've tipped in the last 3 years, but let's get to that later. Tell me about what you've done, what it is, and specifically what your strategy is.
Yeah, so over the last 3 months, I've recruited an amazing team. At the moment, it's all volunteers. We've got about 25 people, and we launched Climate Voice about 5 weeks ago, climatevoice.org. Our goal is to motivate companies, to encourage them, to push them, however necessary, to go all in on climate, meaning anything they do as an organization should be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, with a safe climate future. So keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, ensure a just transition as we make this massive shift globally across the economy. And that's our goal, to get companies to do that across everything they do in their operations, in their supply chain, in their products, and in their advocacy for public policy. Because we need all of that private action. And in the end, the public policy will help steer, I think, a lot of private action. It won't just or even primarily be government spending, but it will be government setting the rules that steer the private sector in the right direction. And without a strong business voice driving that, we're going to continue to see the paralysis we see in most, in Washington, in many state capitals, in lots of other countries for that matter. I mean, the US is, I think, particularly stuck on this, but many other countries are not that much better. So the way we believe we can make companies step up and get off the sidelines is by mobilizing and amplifying the voices of their employees and of students, their future employees. And this seemed like a really good idea a month ago. Some people, I think, were reacting to the current pandemic, which is horrific and which economically is causing enormous pain for lots of people. Some people are reacting to that thinking, well, we can't possibly get employees and students to stand up and push companies to behave better, to be strong allies in the fight against climate change. I actually disagree. I think that it is true that many companies aren't hiring right now and might not be for 3 months, 6 months longer. They will be. We will get through this. We will recover. Companies will be hiring. They will be expanding again. And if they poison the well now on college campuses by continuing to stay on the sidelines and not do what we need on climate, I think that'll come back to hurt them in 2 or 3 years when they do start hiring again. So basically, as I said before, companies today see risk if they speak up on a controversial issue like climate. They see no risk if they stay silent. They see no benefit if they speak up, because an organization that works with them to get them to speak up might put out a press release. Students aren't going to see that. Their employees probably won't see it. Nobody that really matters to them will see it and change their impression of the company. So the companies like Microsoft, like Google, like Facebook, like Apple, like Amazon, like Walmart, there's hundreds of companies that have been acting on climate. They're seen as leaders. They've been mostly silent on policy. And they are seen as leaders. They speak up on policy. The impression people have of them isn't going to change much today. We want to change that by making a lot of noise when they speak up and giving them a lot of benefit then reputationally, and when they stay silent, calling them out and holding them accountable.
And Bill, in terms of the mechanism you're using, it's the reason I started focusing on corporations is I thought that it wasn't enough. We didn't have enough time to have a grassroots movement build up over a decade or three on climate, and that we needed power. We needed the most powerful entities possible to push on policy and to help jumpstart or goose that movement. You're in a way saying, well, we're going to use a grassroots model, but within the corporation. Is you're thinking that that is going to cause rapid change? Because my concern with this would be, instead of going straight to the CEO, it's going to take too long. Tell me about your theory.
I think that's a reasonable fear. I think the short answer, I've been calling this the improv approach to climate. Much like we need innovation, we need investment, we need behavior change, we also need policy. I think similarly here to your point about this is about political power. We need every source, every ounce of political power we can muster. To move companies, I think there are some CEOs that you can convince. But I think a lot of CEOs are, they don't understand the scale of the risk. They don't understand how big the systemic risk is. And their attitude generally about public policy, I think, comes from the last 40 years of neoliberal economics, which is that we take care of our business, others take care of theirs, and good outcomes result. And I think to change that, we need to give them some real motivation. So there are people certainly trying to talk to CEOs directly, working to give them inspiration and insight that will actually get them to have an epiphany and change the way they're approaching this. I think that's valuable and vital. At the same time, I think that we can apply a lot of pressure, positive and negative, from employees and from students that will take this seemingly distant, remote threat of climate and turn it into a near-term operational issue for the company. If you can't hire the people you need to hire, if you can't retain the people you need to retain, you can't operate. And in the economy we have this moment, that's not as immediate an issue, but it will be again. And when companies are trying to hire, if we can motivate 20% of the top computer science graduates and the 20% of the top law students and 20% of the top healthcare workers and other engineering fields and on to essentially say, I don't want to work for a company that's sitting on the sidelines and is complicit with the fossil fuel industry destroying my future, that is going to make a material difference in the ability of those companies to hire and to retain the employees they already have. And I believe that that will get some of them, not all of them, but some of them, to get off the sidelines and really speak up. And we don't need, 50% of major companies to actually speak up. We need a few dozen to get in there and use their influence in a way that they aren't today. Sorry, Auden, you're muted.
That's a huge point in that people think we need all the people. We don't. We need 5 or 10%. We don't need all the corporations. We need a few more than Patagonia.
Right.
So,
right. I mean, today, when you look at battles over state policies, you'll often see 5 or 10 companies weighing in favor of a climate policy. Occasionally, you'll get 20, 50, maybe more, but usually it's on the order of 5 to 10. And we think over the next couple of years, we can change that to be 30 to 50. And if we do that, I think that significantly shifts the balance of political power on a lot of these.
And specifically, when I get angry about this, I'll often get pushback that, 1,100 people signed, we're still in. To me, that's almost a cowardly act in that you're hiding a pile of names. And what you're specifically asking for is greater risk, is hanging it out there more. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're targeting specific legislation in specific states and specific elections in the next 6 months? Is that how you're approaching it? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we don't want companies to just sign some general statement and express support for climate action and climate policy. We want to then get them to step up on specific policies. So we are setting out this North Star of companies being all in, but then we are running campaigns, petition campaigns, and then over time, when we can actually gather in one place again, hopefully more visible demonstrations, campaigns calling on companies to support very specific, meaningful policies in specific states and regions. And we launched with 3. One is a clean energy bill in Virginia, which actually passed a couple weeks ago. It's now on the governor's desk. Commits the state to 100% zero carbon electricity by 2045. The second one is a clean energy bill in Illinois, which commits it to zero carbon electricity by 2030. And then the third is the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is a cap and trade system for transportation emissions on the East Coast. Covers 12 states. If they all sign on, will cover 12 states from Maine down to Virginia, plus the District of Columbia. And each of these is a very significant climate policy in a region where it has a chance of passing. Virginia has passed, but where it's in no way a slam dunk. Where corporate support will really matter, and where honestly, I think the political risk for companies of speaking up is relatively low. So we think that these are examples where we can start by getting companies to dip their toe in the water. A few already are. There are companies like Unilever and Patagonia and Salesforce and IKEA and others Mars who've been very vocal. Most companies have been silent. We think we can get other companies to speak up on some of these policies, and get them used to the idea that it's not all risk and no reward if they speak up. There's actually reward and there's risk if they stay silent. And then begin to repeat this on other policies. Eventually, at the national level, we'll see where we are, next spring after the election in the fall. But our focus for now is state and local policy and regional, because we think that's where there's progress to be made. Obviously, things have changed with the pandemic. Most state legislatures are effectively shut down, but there is still some activity happening. And then at the federal level, there's the stimulus. And there have been a few rounds of stimulus already. There will almost certainly be more. And one of the big questions around that is, will it be used to simply rebuild the economy the way it's been? Or will we direct it in a way that helps us build the economy we need to have in the future, where we're on a path toward 50% cut in emissions by 2030 and 100% cut in emissions by 2050? I think that to me is a big question. Will companies step up and advocate not just to get their, what they want from the stimulus and the recovery to help them survive as an individual company, but to help society get what it needs to avoid catastrophic climate change?
Yeah, I like, your approach is using 2 kind of tried and true elements of revolution: the students, which are typically part of all revolutions and where revolutions start, and then the workers, which from one line of thinking, Marxism, is where the power lies over the corporate sector. So I like that approach to leverage. One of the things I've run into when a corporation lobbies for a specific issue is that you get a hearing with a congressperson or a senator, and Citizens Climate Lobby does this. They go in and they say, we want to lobby specifically for a carbon fee and dividend. And to me, that's a problem because it gives the elected official an out. In other words, they say, I don't like that policy, but I care about this issue. And what I think corporations need to do more of is, here's a policy, but don't let us box you in. You have to be working on climate as a priority, and we're going to be watching you. That was my concern when I first saw, hey, you're going to target these specific things in specific states. To me, there has to be an and, which is ultimately this is a primary issue for us, And it's not about this law, it's about your action at the state level. And by the way, it's going to require federal action pretty soon too, or we're not going to meet timelines. You know, Paris itself, as a listener pointed out, is not enough.
There we go. Awesome. Yes, I agree. I think there is a risk when companies support just a specific policy and then only that policy, that it's easy for legislators to say, well, I don't like that one, so thanks for your input. I think that we do need companies to get in there and really raise climate, as Sheldon Whitehouse has said, as a critical issue that they are in favor of real action and real policy on. And I think companies need to actually, I mean, I love what Citizens Climate Lobby is doing and has done in a lot of ways, but I think a lot of companies, the ones that do speak out some on policy, some of them tend to focus on a policy, like a price on carbon, fee and dividend, or a carbon tax or something, and then no other policies. And the truth is, we need a broad suite of climate policies. We could certainly use a price on carbon. That's not necessarily, it is certainly not the only policy we need. In many jurisdictions, I think we found that a carbon tax is very hard to enact because people see the prices of some things rise, and that makes them nervous. Even if they're going to get it back as a dividend, they're not sure that they will end up actually better off than they were. So we need a range of policies. California has a broad suite of policies. New York now has a broad suite of policies. And we need policies that will give us reasonable confidence that we'll actually get on the decarbonization path we need to be on. So I think that includes a price on carbon. It includes clean energy mandates like what just passed in Virginia. And we need companies to get in there and say, we want to see climate policy that actually gives us certainty that we will avoid these catastrophic pathways that we're currently headed down, and be willing to negotiate and help shape those policies so that they actually, happen, as opposed to just saying, we support this one, and the legislator says, well, I don't, and then you're done. That's not a good way to negotiate, to start off by saying, please vote for this. You want to go in and talk about what your goals are and what you care about, which is, decarbonization, just transition, things like that. And then go from there to, all right, if we can all agree on that, now let's talk about what policies might actually work. And I think Auden, Simran, can you unmute Auden?
Yeah, 1 second. I can't find him on here. There we go. There we go. Hold on.
Yeah.
I'm clicking unmute, but it's not unmuting. There we go. Alden, looks like you're up.
Yeah.
Is that good? Okay.
Yeah.
That's the scary part of Zoom. There are a lot of people on this call, and I want to get to their questions. I want to ask you two more quick things, Bill. I want to end with, have I missed anything? How can people support you? How can they participate in this effort? But before that, am I mistaken, or are you mistaken in the notion that the operational work undertaken by corporations is not meaningful enough? It makes me question myself, because virtually no corporations of all the ones working on climate policy or climate are doing what you're advocating or what I'm advocating. Are we missing something? And is it more meaningful than we think? I'm pretty skeptical there. So that's question one. And then I'd love for you to roll into how can people help with what you're doing? What things did you not get to talk about to the group that you want to talk about? And then I think we should open it up to questions, and I'll let our moderator do that.
Yeah, That's great. Yeah, so I would say, as I said before, it's yes and. I mean, I think that we saw with LGBTQ rights, companies went from not paying attention to the issue 30 years ago to instituting internal policies, and eventually we weren't going to get the progress that people wanted and needed at the pace we needed without social policy, public policy, and companies eventually stepped up and supported that. I think that 15 or 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, a lot of people thought the role of companies here is to decarbonize their own operations. They have a footprint, they should eliminate it. And let the public policy apparatus find some solution that will then help decarbonize society. And if you go back before 2010, with Waxman-Markey, we thought we had a policy in the US that maybe was going to accomplish that. Waxman-Markey probably wasn't strong enough, but it would have been a step, and we could have strengthened it, perhaps. In the end, that fell apart. And I think that many companies are sticking to, I don't know if they have a clear theory of change in their minds about, if they keep doing what they're doing, going carbon neutral, buying clean energy, going carbon negative, that if everyone just did that, somehow we'd get where we need to get. I'm pretty convinced that if everyone did that, first of all, I don't think everyone will. I don't think everyone can. Secondly, I don't think it can happen fast enough just through those kinds of voluntary choices. I mean, I've got natural gas in my house here. Half the residences in the US have natural gas. We need to stop combusting natural gas and having it leak out of the pipes and go into the atmosphere. And we burn as much natural gas, at least in California, in buildings as we do in power plants. So there's a lot of CO2 that comes from buildings, just from fossil fuels combusted on site. We need to stop doing that. And you could say, well, it's about voluntary action. Maybe if we put a price on carbon, people will suddenly run out and buy new stoves and furnaces and so on. I think that will take a very long time. It will take a very high price on carbon. And it'll take a long time before we stop building new buildings that are plumbed for natural gas. So we need policies that start to shift the whole market, whether it's in buildings or transportation or just electricity. And those need to be designed in a smart way that ensures a certain amount of equity in terms of how the impacts are felt. But I don't think we get there just through voluntary action. I think a lot of people at companies would probably agree with that if you push them hard, but you'd have a hard time getting them to talk about it publicly, much like your friend at Microsoft was unwilling to say why they won't speak up. I think a lot of NGOs used to have the theory that, well, if we got companies to be aggressive in their action, that would show legislators what's possible and would then give legislators the courage and the motivation to actually enact more aggressive policy, and that would then spiral upward. That ambition loop, as they call it, has really not played out, in part because we've got a very active force on the other side working to disrupt it and to prevent that progress on the policy front. So I think, if we're going to decarbonize 50% by 2030, it's not just voluntary action. It's not just companies standing up and saying, we're doing great things in our operations. We need policies that will drive that progress, and the same kinds of solutions that will scale them to society at large. In terms of the help we need, the first thing is just listening. I mean, I think part of it is, I don't think most people, when you ask them, what should leading companies do on climate? I don't think they say they should speak up on policy. They think, oh, they should buy clean energy. They should clean up their fleet of vehicles. They should, if they're shipping things by air and sea, they should clean that up. They should clean up their supply chain. And I don't think most people understand. I certainly didn't understand, and have only really come to appreciate it well in the last few years. I don't think most people understand how important a role policy plays in this ecosystem of all the things we need to address climate, and what kinds of policies we need, and the vital role that companies can play in getting that policy in place. So I think spreading the word on that is important. Signing the Climate Voice Pledge at climatevoice.org, which basically says, if you're looking for a job or if you have a job, you will prioritize working for a place that is all in on climate, or at least if you've got choices, and in the current economic climate, people may not have as many choices as they did, but when you do, that you will choose the company that is better. That if you have a job, you will push your employer from the inside to really be all in and to support policies, not just the ones that benefit them directly, but climate policies broadly. And you'll spread the word. So sign the pledge, spread the word, do what you can to actually get people to understand that this is about system change, which is not just about individual action. It is about setting the rules that drive the collective action we need.
Amen, brother. So I'm going to turn this over to the moderator to answer questions. A couple of notes. One is, Bill, thank you for taking time to do this, and thanks to everyone who it's hard to make meetings, and we really appreciate it. On the Q&A, to the Canopy moderator, I'd urge you to ask the question quick, and then Bill, you make an effort to give a quick, concise answer, because we seem to have 150 people here and we want to bang through as many as we can. So if that works, I will now turn this over to the moderator.
Hi all, Simran here speaking from Canopy. So if you could just raise your hand if you have a question. The way you can do that is if you click on the icon labeled participants at the bottom of your screen. At the bottom of the window on the right-hand side, you'll see the raise your hand button. So I'm going to go through, and I'm going to start with Michael Green. Michael, you're unmuted, so you can go ahead and ask your question.
Great. Thank you so much for the remarks, and I trust and hope that you guys can all hear me well. Bill, thank you so much for walking us through and the work that you're doing. Michael Green, Executive Director of Climate Exchange, working with businesses across New England on TCI and some of the policies you mentioned, as well as the working group leader for American Sustainable Business Council on climate and energy policy. Two pieces to my question. First, I was on a webinar right before this with the Gold Standard and Carbon Disclosure Project talking about science-based targets initiative coming out of corporates. So I wanted to hear from your thoughts on how maybe there's targets in there that you're looking to champion within the corporate announcements. And then the second piece on some of the policies that you said that you're eyeing out and looking at. I know, as I imagine you know as well, those longer term goal setting targets don't have science backing them up because we don't have a methodology to get to there yet. So I'm a little bit curious to, with some of the corporate announcements on science-based targets, what is your notion and feeling on that? And with some of the policies that we don't have a pathway towards, what is your mindset on those kind of longer term goal setting? Thank you.
Sure. I think science-based targets are, sort of a piece with the, companies buying clean energy or going carbon neutral, or, it's basically cleaning up their own backyard. And I think it's important. And if a company isn't trying to clean up its own backyard, then it hasn't been paying attention, basically, I would say. So I think that's important. I do think that if a company really wants to lead on climate, you have to assume they're going to be leaders and laggards. And if you're going to lead, you need to go well beyond what science says the economy as a whole needs to do. You really need to move much, much faster than the economy as a whole. And that really gets to the point about being all in. Our point is, as I said before, it's yes and. We want companies to clean up their own backyard, to clean up their supply chain, and to lobby for the policies that will clean up our collective backyard, rather than letting the fossil fuel companies dominate that discussion and basically delay and stymie progress. And then your second question, Michael, remind me.
Sorry, my second part of the question was on policy. Some of the policy goals that you're looking at are the long-term policy initiatives, but we don't have a methodology through policy to reach them, looking at even TCI or something like that, it's not leading to the real climate impact that we would want. Or if it's 100% renewables, we don't have the policy strategy to reach 100% renewables in the time frame that they've set them.
Right. Well, most of the 100% clean energy bills in states are, or at least some of them are, zero carbon by a certain date, not 100% renewable, which means they allow typically nuclear and large hydro, which are not considered renewable, but they get to decarbonization of the electricity sector. And you're right. I would say that in some ways we have the policy mechanisms. We may not have all the technologies we need, but we have a lot of what we need to get us, 80% of the way there in the next decade for some of these things. And that gives us the time to figure out whether it's new technologies or different policies, depending on the structure of electricity markets and so on, that might work. But I'm less concerned about the 2040, 2050 timeframe than I am about the next decade, where if you believe the IPCC, and I'm inclined to, we need to cut emissions in half globally in the next 10 years if we want to have a decent chance of staying below 1.5 degrees of warming. And that's daunting. It's also quite possible, but it requires active choices, not just individual choices, but collective choices. And the electricity sector, we could cut emissions by 70 or 80% in that time frame, and actually probably save money for many people. Transportation, we're not going to cut it by 70 or 80%, but we could cut it by 30 or 40 or maybe 50% in that time frame. Buildings, similar, but it requires making active choices now to drive those changes. And I think that's something we can do and begin to get on the path that we need to be on while we figure out what's going to be needed and what will work in the 2030s and 2040s. To your point about something like TCI not being, that's not going to get the transportation sector on the East Coast on the path it needs to be on. It'll be a big step in the right direction. And I don't think we necessarily, we can try to get the complete solution in one go, or we can try to get there with somewhat incremental improvements to policy. I think that's an example where TCI is a really good big step, sets a precedent, and will allow us to then take further steps beyond that. And I think to some extent you have to go with what's politically feasible, even while you're trying to change what's politically feasible.
Right, thank you. We're going to move on to the next person, Mark Trexler. If you want to go ahead and ask a question.
Hi, Bill. Hi, Auden. A quick question. I'm sort of curious in terms of if companies actually understood the implications of the business implications of getting to a 1.5 or a 2.0 temperature scenario. Would that be a good idea or a bad idea in terms of getting them to sign on to this? I mean, it's easy with a lot of the carbon pricing sign-ons, for example. My sense is that the people signing those have no idea what kind of carbon prices are actually implied by the idea of a 1.5 or a 2. And if they did, they'd be terrified and run the other direction. And so is this an idea of sort of let's hide the ball on what this would actually mean for you and get you to sign on to these commitments? Or is there an alternative way to do that?
No, I don't think it's about hiding the ball. I think that it is about making progress, even if it's not everything we need. I think you're right that a lot of people, when they talk about carbon pricing, they've seen some studies that show that if we have a modest price and it increases slowly, that could drive a 40 or 50% reduction, and it might. Then again, it might not. That's one of the problems, I think, with those kinds of schemes is we don't actually know how the economy and people will respond. We have ideas. I think that if people, if we said we're going to put a $200 a ton price on carbon, that would be $2 a gallon on gasoline. That would have repercussions throughout the economy. I think most people would run the other way. And so that's part of why we don't have a substantial price on carbon, but we need $200 or $500 a ton if that's the only mechanism we use to drive change. But I think with a suite of policies, a price on carbon for when the cost differential between the clean solution and the dirty solution is modest. A small price on carbon can tip that balance and drive individual transactional choices around purchases of cars and buildings and equipment that will begin to shift things. But for things where that price difference is very large, we need other policies that drive scale in the short term, where the cost, that extra cost, is paid by society, not by individuals. And that's what we did with wind and solar over the last 30 years. We had policies like renewable portfolio standards and feed-in tariffs that basically drove deployment where that cost premium was paid broadly by society. And we had tax credits that bought down the price premium even more. And again, that was paid broadly by society, to the point where now wind and solar are cheaper than the dirty alternatives. And now a modest price on carbon is enough to tip those individual decisions by utilities so that we actually shift to wind and solar and other clean sources much faster. But a modest price on carbon 20 years ago would not have driven the scale on wind and solar that actually is what drove that cost improvement. So I think it's about choosing the right policies that work. Hal Harvey has an amazing book called Designing Climate Solutions. I don't know, Mark, you're probably familiar with it. I don't know if other people are, but he really goes through, he and his co-authors and his colleagues go through what kinds of policies work in what kinds of situations. And I think the key is to pick a suite of policies that together will drive the changes we need. It can be done without huge economic costs. In fact, broadly, I think all the research that I've seen says that the cost, if you will, of doing that is far less than the cost of not acting, because the cost of not acting on the economy and on people's lives is enormous.
Thank you for that. We now have Stephen Bay, who has the next one coming up.
Hi. First, I wanted to say thanks, Auden and Bill. I think policy is one of the 3 pillars to accelerate to a sustainable economy. So thank you for your work on Climate Voice, Bill. You are working to get employees to drive corporate decisions on policy. In your opinion, where does a company's sphere of responsibility in regards to their employees' emissions outside the office? For example, residential energy consumption is expected to increase, by my opinion, about 10 to 30% with everybody working from home. So where does that responsibility lie? Where do the emissions and the cost of that increase, where does that lie? And I'm Stephen Bay, by the way.
Stephen, I think that's a good question. And I think that we really need to think about this as a system. And it's not about, oh, there's a molecule of CO2 over there, and here's the person responsible, and they need to mitigate it somehow. You know, at some level, I'm responsible for the emissions in my house. And someday, if I can convince my wife, maybe we'll, you know, replace our stove. And someday, I hope. But the issue is not just those individual decisions or the choices that individual employees make, perhaps with help from their employer. The issue is society is set up in a way, and the market is set up in a way that is difficult to make different choices. We need collectively to decarbonize, and we need to figure out the changes to the system that will drive that. Having companies step up and say, you know what, I'm going to take responsibility for my employees' emissions at home or for commuting or whatever, I think that's great. That will drive some progress. But unless all companies did that, we're not going to get the progress we need at the pace we need it.
Thank you. We've got Matthew. Oh, sorry. Okay, it's Venkatesh who's coming up now. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Venkatesh Srinivas, engineer at Google. Thank you very much for speaking. One objection that we've sometimes seen, or answer we've seen when advocating for companies to speak on policy, is that they sometimes speak through trade associations such as REBA. Do you see this as mitigating or like taking the place of direct company speaking, or is it just deflection? Thanks.
I would rather have companies speak through their trade associations and be silent. But I think there is generally much more impact when a company speaks up directly, whether it's writing op-eds or sending their lobbyists. So I would say, yeah, speak through REBA, speak through the Chamber of Commerce, if you can get them to speak on the right side of this issue, but speak up individually, because that carries a lot of weight. And when it's just trade associations, it carries much less weight. You know, when a company actually stands up and says, this is something that really matters to us, and it's going to affect decisions we make in the future about what offices to expand, where to build new facilities, where to create economic development, and so on. That really makes a difference, certainly at the state and local level. It's hard for most companies aren't going to make that choice at the national level in terms of this country versus that, but some could. But even then, the influence that companies have when they stand up individually and press the case, I think is important. And so they need to do both. It can't just be through trade associations.
We have Matthew Hamilton up next.
Thanks. Hey, Auden, Bill, thanks for your time. My question is, what have you seen as being successful strategies to lead CEOs of publicly held companies that have already announced SBTs, made RE100 commitments, and lobbied in groups in DC with like-minded companies through BICEP or through REBA to prioritize climate action and take the kind of action you desire that really is that individual action? What kind of arguments have you made, or what has been compelling? How have you moved CEOs in your own experience?
Well, we launched Climate Voice 5 weeks ago. So the short answer is we haven't created a lot of change yet. However, I will say that in Virginia, a number of companies, I think about 8 non-energy companies, spoke out publicly on the clean energy bill there. I know several other companies that lobbied behind the scenes, but decided not to speak publicly. And some of those spoke up in part because they knew Climate Voice was coming and they wanted to get in front of what we're doing. And I've heard from people at other companies as we've reached out to them on TCI on the East Coast or the clean energy bill in Illinois. I've heard from people at other companies that the idea that their workforce, current and future workforce, cares about this is new to them, that it's a growing movement that we hope to grow quickly. But that is something that matters to the company and that will affect the way they choose, when they choose, how they choose to engage on public policy in the future. This is something they can take to their public affairs team, government affairs team, and give them a real reason why they should speak up. Whereas in the past, the answer has usually been, this doesn't benefit us and it creates risk, so we're just going to stay silent. And now that equation is changing. And I'm hearing from people, sustainability leaders and others at companies, that they see how this is going to change. And, you know, to quote Wayne Gretzky, I'm not a hockey fan, but I'll quote him anyway. You know, he said that if you want to play hockey well, skate where the puck is going, not where it's been. And I think what companies have been doing, decarbonizing their own operations, very occasionally speaking up on policy, that was the leadership. That was real leadership for the last decade, and maybe it was what we needed for the last decade. Where the puck is going for the next decade, what we need and what I think the workforce is going to start to demand is that companies actually actively step up and help drive the kind of system change we need. And that's going to be public policy in addition to all the other things.
Thanks, Bill. So we have 4 more questions left, so we'll get through them before we, and then we can wrap up. Next up is Holly Kaufman.
Thank you, Bill. Terrific, of course, as always, and congratulations. So very
Thanks,
quickly,
Holly.
2 questions. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
So you mentioned that you're using Paris as a sort of bar for getting companies to comply with and to push for. And since we know that Paris won't get us where we're going, I'm just wondering if that's the measuring stick that you're sticking with or getting them to push for something beyond that. And then secondly, you talked a bit about the Corona recovery money. And I know there are a lot of efforts going on now with, you know, greenies and fossil fuel and petrochemical companies. Everybody's lobbying Congress like crazy for their piece of the pie, and all the Dems and the lefties who are trying to use this tragedy as an opportunity to build a new clean economy, you know, we're all talking to themselves. So what, if any, effort might the companies you're working with be pushing, particularly Republicans in the Senate, to not give the money to fossil fuel and such companies, but to, fund a net zero carbon path?
Yeah. Well, so to your first point about Paris, when I referred to Paris, I really meant the goal of Paris to keep warming well below 2 degrees, ideally below 1.5. Not the specific, nationally determined contributions, the NDCs that countries put forward.
Okay.
So we are focused on a future where warming is ideally kept below 1.5 degrees and not much above it if we can't manage that, and with a just transition. So that's what I mean by Paris, not the NDCs specifically.
Okay.
Because you're right, the NDCs that were agreed to in 2015 in Paris were not sufficient to meet that goal of well below 2 degrees.
Right.
In terms of the green stimulus or whatever it might be called, I think the politics around this are really, really messy and complicated, and the time frame for all of these negotiations, especially to date, have been really tough. We are talking to lots of other groups and trying to see what we could do to get some companies to step up and advocate for rebuilding the country and the economy in a way that does lead us toward a zero carbon future at the pace we need, as opposed to just rebuilding the economy that we've had. I don't know if we're going to be able to get many or any companies to actually speak up in society's interest, not just their own narrow self-interest. Companies, I think, are really terrified that they won't get what they need to survive this pandemic. And that is keeping them on the sidelines when it comes to these questions of green stimulus. We hope we can change that. And I hope that some companies will have the courage, and it's courage because they are taking a risk, the courage to step up and advocate for what we all need, not just for what they need. We'll see.
Well, I'm happy to talk to you offline. If there's anything I can do to, on a volunteer basis to help, I'd be happy to.
Awesome. Thanks.
Great. We have Catherine up next.
Right. Thank you, Bill, for your work with Climate Voice. And I'm a follower now, waiting to see how this goes. And my question is, how are companies prioritizing climate change? I see when we talk about the Paris Agreement and, reducing the impact of climate, we're talking about water, energy, and all the other components within operations that they can do to reduce, emissions. How are they prioritizing? I know a lot of, CEOs will come forward and say we're supporting the climate agreement, but that is a big picture, really. How do we see that from the outside as future employees? How do we see that from the outside, that they're actually doing what they talk about rather than, just saying, oh, we're supporting the climate, the Paris Climate Agreement, following all that? How do we see that?
That's a really good and important question. Not that all the questions have been good, but I think that is one that has come up again and again. And so if you want to see what a company is doing operationally with its carbon footprint, you can go to CDP, and actually CDP has information on water and so on. If you want to understand what a company is doing on policy, there isn't a great place to go today. There's a group in the UK called Influence Map, which is trying to basically score companies on how they use their influence on climate. And we are working with them. At the moment, they don't cover enough companies, they don't cover enough policies in enough jurisdictions, but they are getting at the question of, what are companies doing around lobbying, around campaign contributions, around trade association memberships, and so on. What we're trying to do is then, by focusing on individual specific policies, is basically hold companies to account for those policies and whether they step up. And we're talking about, or possibly with Influence Map, building a scorecard or a scoreboard that would show how companies are doing, not just on the policies where we're running campaigns on and petition drives, but more broadly. So you could then go ask, all right, I'm interested in working at these 7 companies. Which ones are actually speaking up and getting in there to help drive the future we need versus which ones are on the sidelines and kind of letting the status quo continue. We don't have that yet. I hope that in the next few months we will. But I think it's something that's going to be really important.
Thank you.
Great. We've now got Eckhart Beatty, who is next.
Hello. My question is why companies that have taken bold action, incorporated them in their policies, take, for example, Patagonia, and if at the same time their share prices have gone up astronomically, companies like that, why don't they say, well, this is what we've done, and by the way, we've done pretty well financially as well. And even companies that haven't done quite so well, they've saved lots of money on heating and cooling and all the whole list of things, which are directly, maybe not one-to-one, but directly related to some common component of climate change, of just reducing the carbon, because you're using less energy. So.
I mean, I think that companies that have been leading, whether it's on their individual action in their own operations, or some like Patagonia that have been speaking up, and Aspen for that matter, Auden has been a leader on this and has been really calling on other companies and other corporate leaders to speak up. I think there's a certain amount of leadership by example that works, and a certain amount of encouragement from peers that can be really helpful. I think most of the companies that have spoken up to date have less regulatory risk if they do annoy some policymaker than the ones that than some of the ones who've been staying on the sidelines. And I think that's one of the reasons they stay on the sidelines. So that's where we hope to shift that balance for them, so that their risk calculus is a little different. There have been a few like Patagonia who've been leading, but I don't think that it's enough for other CEOs to hear from the CEO of Patagonia, Joe, you need to get your company to step up. That clearly has not been enough, because I think that the CEOs of the few companies that have been leading on this have spoken to their peers. It hasn't moved them yet. I think it's going to take some real, pressure, positive and negative pressure, to make that happen.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
We now have our last question by Laurent. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. You can hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, so thank you, everybody. Thank you, Bill. So I've been very impressed by the shift that live data in our coronavirus crisis, unfortunately, has brought to the world, right? The scenarization that's, for me, started in an academic center of Johns Hopkins, and I was referring to this live data, and finally the power of this data. So is there a place where climate change is scenarized with this kind of power? And of course, it's a bit more lengthy, and it's a bit more difficult, but is there a place for you where we can find that?
I'm not quite sure. Are you asking, is there similar data around climate change that we could use, that exists today, that we could use to sort of motivate people differently? Is that your question, or
yeah, I mean,
or are you simply?
Yes, a place where things would be scenarized a little bit in the same way. You can see the peak of it in Alaska, and you can see things moving a little bit faster than just getting the information from here and there.
That's a good question. I don't know that I have a great answer. I mean, I do think that there are interesting parallels between this pandemic and the way it has played out, and society's reaction, and climate. The climate crisis is playing out over years and decades, and this pandemic is playing out over days and weeks, or maybe months. There's a direct threat to many people's lives. Though even then, it took quite a while for some people to really understand the threat, even though we had data from Italy and from China and from other places, and scientific projections about how this could play out epidemiologically. A lot of people didn't really acknowledge the severity of the problem. And part of that, I think, is just, we all have a really hard time understanding and really connecting with nonlinear change. And, you know, the exponential growth of an epidemic is an example of that. The nonlinear change we're seeing with climate is an example of that. We tend to, you know, if you've got 10 cases today, you can imagine 100 in a few weeks. It's really hard to imagine 1,000 in just a few weeks. That seems just like too much growth. But yet that's what happens. So I think, you know, the data might help people act differently on climate. But the only other thing I would point out is I do think, and Auden said this, climate is a political problem, right? It is about political power. And there is a very wealthy group of interests in society that is doing everything it can to delay and stymie progress because it threatens their wealth and their livelihood. And that's the fossil fuel companies. And the key thing we need to do is marshal political power on the other side to drive progress. And I think some of that can be done with rational, you know, appeals to data and projections about the future, but I think some of it is going to require positive and negative pressure. I mean, the climate movement has been putting out data for decades now, and the other side has been putting out misinformation and trying to confuse the issue for decades. That's not going to change. So better data, I think, is going to help. And as there are more wildfires and more extreme heat and more droughts and so on, that will maybe be sink in for more people. But I think that in truth, part of it really has to be about looking for where the missing elements of political power are and doing everything we can to bring those to the, you know, to the fight.
Thanks.
Okay.
Sure. My pleasure.
Well, it looks like, you know, we're out of time at this point. Thank you so much, Bill, for doing this with us. We had a great turnout. I have recorded this for everybody, and I have everybody's email addresses because you all registered over Eventbrite. I'll send you an email tomorrow when the video is up on our Facebook and our YouTube channels, and feel free to share with everybody. And we're also hoping that once everything calms down and we're able to like kick back up with our live events, we can have you back again, Bill. And
That'd be great. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks everybody for joining. Auden, really great to have this discussion with you, and everyone stay safe.
All right. Stay safe, everybody. Bye. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks all. Take care. Bye.
Bye.